书我最爱读，千遍那个万遍又下功夫，深刻的道理我细心领会，只觉得心眼里头热乎乎。好像那旱地里下了一场及时雨呀，小鸟儿挂满了露水珠啊，毛主席的语录滋养了我呀，我赶紧那革命牵头而走。一字字一行行，一边那个读来我一边想，革命的真理金光闪，句句话儿说在我的心坎上。好像那一表是打开了千把锁呀，心眼里升起了红太阳啊，毛泽东思想武装了我呀，我永远握紧手中枪，我永远握紧手中枪。
这一辈子忙的幸福，走一辈子革命的路，一辈子再造思想，一辈子为人民服务。梦醒的祖国，革命的梦是一片蓬勃的正大方向。学习好，换一换就迎日天；学习好，换一换迎满月儿落；学习好，不会让我陌生；学习好，和你共同迈大步。学一辈子毛主席的书，走一辈子革命的路，一辈子再造思想，一辈子为人民服务。梦醒的祖国，革命的梦是一片蓬勃的正大方向。学习好，换一换就迎日天；学习好，换一换迎满月儿落；学习好，不会让我陌生；学习好，和你共同迈大步。 们有多少贴心的话要对你讲？
我们有多少热情的歌要给你唱？
写满了奉献，向着北京，写满长笑脸，迎着红太阳。
庆祝领袖们出席，燃烧我主家。亲爱的毛主席，亲爱的毛主席，你是我们心中的红太阳，你是我们心中的红太阳。
我们有多少贴心的话要对你讲？
我们有多少热情的歌要给你唱？
写满了奉献，向着北京，写满长笑脸，迎着红太阳。
庆祝领袖们出席，燃烧我主家。庆祝领袖毛主席，
太阳永远照四方，江河永远像太阳，各族人民永远怀念毛主席。毛泽东思想永放光芒，永放光芒。我们继承毛主席的意志，朝着毛主席指引的方向。我们肩负革命中人胸怀伟大的理想，夺取社会主义革命的新胜利，谱写社会主义建设的新篇章。各族人民紧密团结在党中央周围，一定要实现共产主义伟大理想。一定要实现共产主义伟大的理想，伟大的理想。
Hello, everybody, and welcome. It's another visit to the reading group tonight, and we're going to be doing something a little bit different because, of course, we're looking at a couple of works by the great Chairman Mao. The primary one that we'll be looking at is on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. That's the later one. But we're going to be starting off with a look at an earlier work, which is the earlier work, which is from 1949, and it's on the People's Democratic Dictatorship. Now, I'm choosing to start with an earlier one because of the need to set up what's explained in greater detail and at a slightly more advanced way in the later document, because, of course, the first one comes in 1949. This is immediately before the final triumph of the Chinese Revolution. And that's, of course, a speech that Mao gave on the commemoration of the 28th anniversary of the CPC. And the later one comes in 1957, after the revolution has been, well, in power for 8 years. So it's a slightly different take. But the roots of the later one, can be found in the explanation of the People's Democratic Dictatorship, which Mao gives in 1949. So I think one follows nicely along from the other, and it gives us an opportunity to talk about the way in which the Chinese Revolution was formed, what were the forces that created the way in which that the new Chinese state was built, because of course it's built in a slightly different way than the workers' state that came into existence after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. The Chinese Revolution took a different path. And to understand the People's Republic of China in the modern era, I think you have to understand these initial works and the actions of the leadership in the era of Mao as one of the premier leaders. I think it's fair to say they're certainly the most influential singular leader, though it would be very inaccurate, as many Western historians do, to say that simply, of course, as they do with Stalin, that, oh, Mao was the great dictator, he was a madman, he was, X, Y, and Z. The truth is, once you start digging into the actual history of the Chinese Revolution, you'll find that Mao had to contend with many different competing tendencies within the Communist Party of China and more widely within Chinese society itself. And this was complicated additionally by the fact that they weren't in a one-party state by any means. In fact, to this day, there's several different parties that exist inside the Chinese political system who date their origins back to the period of the New Democracy period, the People's Democratic Dictatorship period, which we're going to be talking about today. But first, just a little bit of background, of course. As Mao outlines in the document that we'll be discussing on today's live stream, the origins of the Communist Party of China, of course, lie partly in the inspiration provided to people like Mao, who was a young man when the Bolshevik Revolution triumphed, and he was a young man who'd been influenced by revolutionary nationalist ideas and anarchist ideas to a degree. And he outlines here why, of course, so many in China were inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution, including the man who he quotes extensively in this document, in his work, Sun Yat-sen. Now, Sun Yat-sen was, of course, the leader of, or one of the early leaders of the movement that came to become known as the Kuomintang movement. And Sun Yat-sen is, to this day, a revered figure in China, in the People's Republic of China, even though, of course, he founded the movement which would go on to be the Comprador movement headed by Chiang Kai-shek. Sun Yat-sen is somebody who is paid tribute to by Mao as a great bourgeois revolutionary, even though ultimately his movement, his revolution, could not but end in failure. So that's an interesting way to see into how the Communist Party of China is formed in response to this ultimate failure of the bourgeois and petty bourgeois nationalist revolution, or attempted revolution. See, after the last Chinese dynasty finally collapses, you get the institution of, or the attempted institution of, a bourgeois democratic republic in 1911 in China. And this, of course, is swiftly dismantled, and you get the period known as the period of the warlords. And after the Bolshevik Revolution, Sun Yat-sen, though nominally the first president of the Chinese Republic, of course, he ended up losing power to various warlords, and the nation descended into a period of anarchy and civil war, which still is something which marks the politics of the People's Republic of China to this day. You see, the period of anarchy, the period of war, follows what the Chinese leaders, again, to this day refer to as the century of humiliation, when the Chinese empire is declining, when it is being routinely humiliated by the British imperialists in the Opium Wars, and later by the imperialists of all Europe, including the Russian Empire, who were seizing various different bits of the Chinese coastline in particular, and turning them into concessions and international ports like Port Arthur, Hong Kong, Macau, which of course Hong Kong was stolen by the British Empire, Macau by the Portuguese Empire. And this rivalry over China looks like it's going to disintegrate the Chinese state almost entirely. And as a response to the nation almost being divided and devoured by the imperialist powers, you get various different uprisings going on throughout the 19th century. You get the epic and very bloody Taiping Rebellion, which was ended after British imperialist intervention on the side of the fading dynasty. And then you get the Boxer Rebellion, which was a rebellion against foreign domination that took place in the very earliest part of the 20th century, in 1900. And this, of course, caused more imperialist intervention. And it got to the point where in the Western imperialist journals at the time that where these things were discussed openly, the British and the other European powers were arguing over how best to dismember China, who was going to get the biggest share of it, what was the best way to manage it, because they all anticipated that this decaying feudal empire was going to collapse, and that they were going to dismember it and divide it up amongst themselves, and that they would need some new treaties to govern this. And so this is the background in which first Sun Yat-sen's nationalist movement and later the Communist Party of China emerges. And Sun Yat-sen is inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution, and it does radicalize his movement, even though he never became a communist himself. He dies in the early 1920s. And unfortunately, his successor, Chiang Kai-shek, is this like dreadful comprador figure who's an extremely violent and vile anti-communist. He massacres communists repeatedly, having gone back on the agreements which Sun Yat-sen had entered into with them in the early 1920s. They were in a coalition government for a while in one region, and Chiang Kai-shek massacred them all. There was thousands killed by Kuomintang's soldiers. There was many communists who had to go on the run. There were many more who were arrested or murdered or both. And of course, this culminates in ultimately the Long March to escape the repressions of the Chiang Kai-shek regime. Now, of course, Chiang Kai-shek becoming the premier leader of the Kuomintang doesn't change the fact that in actual fact, he doesn't wield an awful lot of power inside China itself. He actually, in actual fact, it's the warlords who, these guys who were either from the old imperial army or who were mercenaries, etc., guys who'd come to power in various different regions across the country. And so Chiang Kai-shek, though, being a man who had made himself into the agent of the Western imperialist powers, was a man who was much more dedicated to fighting the Communist Party of China and massacring communists than he was to actually securing the remit of the at that time it was called Peking government over the rest of the country. And then after, of course, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1941, even at that point, Chiang Kai-shek was devoting most of his energies to trying to destroy the communists. Again, the whole period of the Japanese occupation and the horrific massacres they committed and all the blood that was shed there, a lot of it can be traced back to the fact that the Chinese compradors, like the landlords, the comprador capitalists, were much more concerned with destroying communism than they were with fighting the Japanese. They could make a bargain with the Japanese, as Mao makes clear in a lot of his writings. Of course, this is exactly the same, or at least bears a lot of similarities to what was going on in the West, of course, where you had the French ruling class happily capitulate in 1940 in order that they could use the Nazis to try and extirpate the communists. So this is not exactly a new thing. In fact, wherever you got an invasion, the whole question of the Nazi and fascist occupation threw into sharp relief the pre-existing class tensions. And this, of course, reflected very sharply in China, in France, and of course later on in Italy, where you get the division between the pro-fascist and the anti-fascist movements there. So what was going on in China was by no means unique in terms of what was happening, but it was on a much, much bigger scale. China is, of course, a gigantic country. And so you have this war in which the Kuomintang are going after the communists repeatedly, and the communists, led by Mao, are repeatedly offering to the nationalists, to Chiang Kai-shek, a united front against the Japanese invaders. And Chiang Kai-shek refuses and refuses and refuses and pretends to agree sometimes, goes back on his word. Eventually, he is held at gunpoint by some of his own generals and forced to agree to a common front against the Japanese. He wouldn't have agreed to it otherwise. So the whole period up to the end of World War II, of course, is marked by the supposedly joint struggle against the Japanese. And the American imperialists, of course, are involved in China at this time. They do give some aid to the CPC, but they predominantly focus their energies on aiding the Kuomintang, with the knowledge that they would be backing the Kuomintang when the war was over. But of course, what they, to a degree, didn't anticipate was, of course, the rapid collapse of the Japanese forces when the Red Army, the Soviet Red Army, turned up in Manchuria, destroying the Japanese army there. And of course, it has to be emphasized, and here we get into a bit more of World War II history, that the Japanese actually had, for the most part, their best troops, their best equipped land forces, and a lot of their air force was actually in Manchuria and the occupied areas of China. That was the area they really wanted to hold on to, and they really wanted to conquer. And what the Americans and the British were fighting and losing to, in the British case, they lost to the Japanese army in almost every engagement for the first almost 3 years of the war, because the British were incompetently run and were a colonial force more used to shooting unarmed natives than they were to actually fighting anybody. But the point is that the Japanese focus was on Manchuria and the rest of China and keeping hold of that. Incidentally, of course, and here we get into film review territory, the Bernardo Bertolucci film, which is politically a completely disastrous piece of crap, called The Last Emperor, which features the story of the last emperor of China, a guy who went by the name of Pu Yi. He ended up as a Japanese puppet ruler in Manchuria, and after the victory of the revolution, he was actually spared and became, I believe the revolutionary forces assigned him to be a gardener somewhere. So even he didn't actually get the chop after the revolution. So much for the bloodthirsty communists. But the period which we're going to be talking about when we're talking about the triumph of the revolution, you see after the end of World War II, the triumph of the war against the Japanese, you see the Chinese Red Army and Chinese People's Liberation Army, as it's now known, get into the settling of accounts, shall we say, with Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, having failed to maintain any agreement. It takes another 4 years, but by 1948, it's pretty obvious that the Kuomintang have lost and that Chiang Kai-shek is on his way out. This, of course, leads to a load of recriminations inside the imperialist centers, particularly Washington, everybody accusing each other of losing China, which is a bit of a laugh, really, when you consider that the Revolutionary War had been going on for 25 years by that point. So by the time Mao comes to write the work on the People's Democratic Dictatorship, the war is a quarter of a century old at least, and the Chinese Communist Party is actually undergoing its 28th anniversary in 1949. So this is a long, long war. It's a long revolutionary period, a whole over a quarter of a century by later 1949 when the revolution is finally won. So the whole basis for this discussion that we're having now is, of course, what kind of state the Chinese Revolution was to actually create. And here we come to the writing of Mao on this particular issue. So I'm just going to call up our first quote, though, because I think this is a very, very interesting and gives a real indication of the profound revolutionary beliefs of Mao Zedong. So I will call this up, and this is the beginning of the document that we're discussing today. I'll read this out for the benefit of those on the audio version of this. The 1st of July 1949 marks the fact that the Communist Party of China has already lived through 28 years. Like a man, a political party has its childhood, youth, manhood, and old age. The Communist Party of China is no longer a child or a lad in his teens, but has become an adult. When a man reaches old age, he will die. The same is true of a party. When classes disappear, all instruments of class struggle, parties, and the state machinery will lose their function, cease to be necessary, therefore gradually wither away and end their historical mission, and human society will move to a higher stage. We are the opposite of the political parties of the bourgeoisie. They are afraid to speak of the extinction of classes, state power, and parties. We, on the contrary, declare openly that we are striving hard to create the very conditions which will bring about their extinction. The leadership of the Communist Party and the state power of the people's dictatorship are such conditions. So Mao there, of course, is echoing Lenin and Stalin and, of course, Marx and Engels themselves when he's talking about what will the historic mission of the Communist Party of China, or of all communist parties, actually be. And that is ultimately to render yourself in irrelevance and to render the party and the state out of existence. Now, of course, we're talking there about the higher stage of communism, which, as we know now, is something which is going to take a lot longer to achieve. It is not an overnight job. And this is part of the reason why Mao's famous observation, and a very accurate observation, that he will come back to repeatedly in his writings and will be one of the principal animating factors of the Cultural Revolution later on, which is that the class struggle intensifies in the period after the revolution. And he makes it clear in this document we're going to be discussing today, and the later one on the correct handling of contradictions among the people, that this intensification of the class struggle is only partly about the suppression of the internal reactionaries, of those who are opposed to the revolution from because they are representatives of or benefited from the old order, i.e. the old feudal reactionaries, the collaborators with the Japanese, the collaborators with US imperialism. They are only one factor of this. And what Mao was, one of Mao's strengths as a theorist, taking up where Stalin left off, was his ability to see that unless this struggle was waged relentlessly inside the party and inside society itself, out in Chinese society, that you ran every risk of the party's rule becoming bureaucratized, becoming stale, becoming separated from the masses, and you ran a real risk of actual capitalist restoration unless this struggle was engaged in actively. And this is one of the most interesting and penetrating insights of Mao's writing and also his political practice. And this becomes most clear, of course, in the period of the Cultural Revolution, but it's a theme he keeps bringing up because he's very painfully aware of what can happen unless that struggle is acknowledged. Now, it's an interesting comparison to make with, of course, Stalin being aware of that as well, but also Stalin's successors, starting with Khrushchev, specifically denying the fact that the class struggle intensifies after the triumph of the revolution, but also that it will be something that continues until, of course, you reach the point where you've had several generations born under the rule of a workers' state who have, of course, benefited from it and have grown up in a new atmosphere, freed from the repression and suppression that's inflicted upon them by the bourgeoisie, by the imperialists, and who are going to be more suited to becoming the ruling class in a society, the workers becoming the ruling class, than the previous generations were. And so Mao was aware this would take generation after generation to actually get to the point where you have the correct material conditions, but also the correct degree of consciousness, and that the rule of the masses is rooted in the consciousness of the masses. And that this would be, as I say, a titanic project that would take a long time, beyond the lifespan of the current leadership of the party. Now, you compare that to the ludicrous way that the Khrushchevite revisionists carried on after 1956, where you had Khrushchev announcing that we've reached socialism, we're just in a, there's no longer the need for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now we're the dictatorship of, well, we're just a state of the whole people. There's no dictatorship anymore, and there's no need for struggle anymore. And so they actively denied the revisionists in the Soviet Union that there was a class struggle after the revolution. They actively denied the need for struggle. They actively denied for the need for the Marxism of the party to be continually exposed to the criticism of the masses, and to engage with the masses, and to be strengthened through the back and forth process with the masses. And so you see in the Soviet Union what happens is that the official Marxism becomes more and more stale, more and more distant from the proletariat, and more just basically like a Catholic catechism, something which is repeated on high state occasions and in universities, but doesn't actually mean a great deal anymore. It's just become a sort of meaningless bureaucratic language, which is an expression of officialdom. And the supposed cadres of the party don't study very much of anything. They study a few quotes from Marx and Engels and Lenin. They don't actually do what Mao is talking about in an awful lot of his writings, and what Stalin talked about as well, which is you have to refresh Marxism. You have to make sure it's continually relevant to the struggle of the masses, because the party, the cadres of the party, have to be one with the masses and are involved in their struggles, involved in their daily life, and therefore are constantly needing to apply Marxist Leninism in new and creative ways. And only that way can it properly develop, by basically turning it into this sort of hidebound, boring, bureaucratic language and bureaucratic practice. The Soviet revisionists did their very best to kill Marxism-Leninism stone dead. So it's a very interesting reflection on the fact of how great thinker and leader Mao was, that he managed to, he saw this, understood it, and sought to grapple with it. So I'm going to move on now to the next quote. I'm just going to read this out again for the benefit of those on the audio. So, next quote reads as follows: "As everyone knows, our party passed through these 28 years not in peace but amid hardships. We had to fight enemies, both foreign and domestic, both inside and outside the party. We thank Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin for giving us a weapon. This weapon is not a machine gun, but Marxism, Leninism." And of course, that I picked that out principally because it reads well, but also gives you an indication of like why it is that Mao was so concerned with constantly needing to keep Marxism, Leninism fresh and up to date, and make sure that he had it was something which was continually connected with the masses, because this is of course how their revolutionary struggle was constantly strengthened when they were having to fight everybody, when they were having to fight first the internal Chinese reactionaries, having to fight the Japanese, then having to fight later on the American imperialists in the war against People's Korea, which the Chinese of course intervened heroically on the side of. So the way in which the Chinese party is forged, it's forged over 28 years of intense struggle, which is one of the reasons why it became so strong, that and the fact that its leaders, not just Mao, but even those who later became known as revisionists like Liu Shaoqi, were tested in the most serious way possible, which is that you have to fight a generation-long war, be constantly involved in armed struggle for over a quarter of a century. That does a hell of a lot to test a revolutionary party's endurance and their ability to actually apply Marxism-Leninism to this situation that was unprecedented, because of course in the Chinese Revolution it became something that, whilst it was strong with the urban proletariat in its early years, through the necessity, through the fact that they were massacred and driven out of the towns, it became something that was rooted a lot in rural areas and became something that was embraced by the peasantry, which of course Mao wrote extensively about. So he goes on from there in this work to talk about what I was mentioning earlier about Chinese history, and he analyzes some of the different ways in which the Chinese bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie actually failed. So what he comes to in this is he starts talking about the fact that the Chinese bourgeois and petty bourgeois reformers were desperate to actually learn from the West, from the imperialist powers, and that they were unable to do so. So I'll just call up the next quote here. Imperialist aggression shattered the fond dreams of the Chinese about learning from the West. It was very odd. Why were the teachers always committing aggression against their pupil? The Chinese learned a good deal from the West, but they could not make it work and were never able to realize their ideals. So what he's talking about there is, of course, that in the period that we're referring to here, the period being the early part of the Chinese attempted bourgeois revolution, and the before that, the earlier 20th century, very late 19th century, people like Sun Yat-sen and other bourgeois and petty bourgeois radicals in China were constantly looking to Britain, to France, and to the USA to learn lessons from them. They thought that if they went to, or sent their children to, the universities of the West, if they learned particularly from the great empires, that they could reform the Chinese system. And as Mao says there, it took them a while to realize that the imperialists had no real interest in helping them reform their system and had every interest in dismembering it. And the only people they were really interested in assisting were the compradors who would dismantle the country for them. And as Mao says, why did they keep getting beaten by their own teacher? Because they took seriously, the early Chinese bourgeois and petty bourgeois radicals, the idea that these great civilizations would help them. And they had to come to this brutal realization that this was not something that the imperialists were actually interested in. So the fact that that this lesson had to be learned and learnt painfully is something that Mao obviously dwells on. And he talks about how the bourgeois and the petty bourgeoisie of China were incapable of actually leading a revolution. And he talks a little bit about why, and why it was that, to quote a famous phrase from Mao, only communism can save China. Because, of course, he's talking about, and we'll come to this later in the document, the fact that the bourgeoisie of China are very, very weak and incapable of leading anything. So we'll come to that in a moment, but we'll look to like one of the things that Mao identifies as one of the key reasons why the CPC triumphed where the Kuomintang failed. So here is another quote, and I'll read this again for the benefit of those on the audio. Internally, arouse the masses of the people. That is, unite the working class, the peasantry, the urban petty bourgeoisie, and the national bourgeoisie. Form a domestic united front under the leadership of the working class, and advance from this to the establishment of a state which is a people's democratic dictatorship under the leadership of the working class and based on the alliance of workers and peasants. So there's a lot there in terms of what and how the Chinese Revolution was organizing itself. So what I'll do is I'll just go over that. So what he's talking about there is, of course, the way in which the revolution in China came to be formed and how that set up the later formation of the People's Republic. So in these situations where, of course, as Mao observes, you have the you have the working class in China, which is the proletariat, which is, I think it was smaller in the 20s and 30s than even the Russian proletariat was, and much less significant in terms of it being a social force. It was still potentially powerful, but as I said, the Kuomintang managed to repress the Chinese party, Communist Party of China, out of the cities to the point where they had to flee to the countryside. So you have a very small working class. You have an enormous peasantry in China, which is divided into many different layers, most of which are peasants who work a tiny scrap of land, who are subject to essentially a Chinese version of serfdom. And you have of course, the landlord class, which is completely parasitic and backward and just interested in maintaining their domination over the peasants. But you also have what Mao identifies as the urban petty bourgeoisie, small traders, etc., but also the national bourgeoisie. Now, it's worth just pausing and taking a moment to just consider what he means by national bourgeoisie, because this is something which actually is still coming up a lot now. So Mao draws a distinction between what he calls the bureaucrat bourgeoisie, which of course is actually the bourgeoisie which is aligned with the monopoly capitalism in China, and it's those who are most tied up with, first of all, the Japanese imperialists who are collaborating with them, as of course you get bourgeois collaborators with foreign occupiers everywhere. But in the Chinese case, he calls them like the bureaucrat bourgeoisie, and a comparison with the national bourgeoisie. And by that he means those who are non-monopoly capitalists, those who are engaged in industries and areas of trade which are either disadvantaged directly by the Japanese occupation, or who are of a particular point of view and a particular faction within the bourgeoisie whose interests would be better developed by China becoming an independent democratic republic along bourgeois lines, or at least ridding itself of foreign domination. And so Mao identifies them as the national bourgeoisie, those who, for one reason and another, principally dictated by their class interests, are ending up being against the Japanese occupation and imperialist domination of China. And with those, Mao's argument is, and this is indeed what they did, that the proletariat and the peasantry can form an alliance. And this is, of course, what comes to be embodied in the People's Republic, in the People's Democratic Dictatorship. And so Mao, though, in many of his writings goes on to elaborate about what this means, and he's saying that, yes, the capitalism in that early period of the Chinese Revolution hadn't actually been abolished, but the capitalist class weren't actually in power, given that even though the capitalist class were, if they went along with and didn't act against the People's Democratic Dictatorship, they could, for a certain amount of time, still draw profit from their industries, even if those industries were actually taken into public management, at least, as part of the construction of the Chinese 5-year plans and Chinese industrialization. But they were not allowed to actually influence the policy of the government in the way that, of course, the proletariat and peasantry could. But they were able to play a role in the revolution. And so you find that capitalism survives in China in various different places, and the capitalist class survives as a class, but not a class that's allowed political power for, well, over a decade after the triumph of the Chinese Revolution. And this distinction between comprador bourgeoisie and national bourgeoisie actually informs a lot of movements, not just in China, but across the colonized world. To this day, in fact, to this day, you'll find in various different situations that in nations that have been subjected to imperialism, you have the comprador bourgeois whose interests are tied up with the continuing domination of the nation by imperialism. And you'll find that there is a national bourgeois whose interests are better served by the nation truly becoming independent and ridding itself of that imperialist domination. And this is true, I would argue, even in places like Russia, where you have a comprador bourgeoisie that was very much in power in the 1990s, that got to the point where its rule over the nation became so ruinous that it was pushed out of power by a new political formation that was based more in a national bourgeoisie. But of course, as Mao points out, even though the national bourgeoisie are opposed to the domination of the country by imperialism, they still can't take the nation forward. Not really, because they are perpetually afraid of the proletariat, and the proletariat is the only truly revolutionary class, though it can and does act in the Chinese case and in the case of other countries, in close alliance with the peasantry. The national bourgeoisie can play a role in the revolution, Mao argues, but only in supporting the revolution led by the proletariat and the peasantry. Or if you were looking in the Russian case, it would be only in these days could play a progressive role in supporting a return to socialism of some kind. And that, interestingly enough, is what the Communist Party of the Russian Federation argues. But we'll return to that on a future occasion. But needless to say, this is a very much misunderstood development when it comes to China and how it's applied elsewhere. So I'm just going to pause to take in some comments from the chat. Hello to Sneaks. Paul Charo says, comrades from a granny flat, soon to be leaving as the owner, is a hysterical, sly, condescending, selfish, delusional old fool who is too much to bear despite the cheap rent. Well, that's got to be some serious arsehole of a landlord to give up on cheap rent, mate. Pablo says, wasn't the Kuomintang revolutionary at the time? Started out as a revolutionary petty bourgeois / bourgeois movement, became deeply reactionary very, very quickly because, of course, as I was just saying, the bourgeoisie, even those who are opposed to foreign domination, are still terrified of the masses, and they're more terrified of the masses quite a lot of the time than they are of foreign domination. So hence why Mao says they can't lead a revolution. And this goes back, this isn't Mao's discovery uniquely. This is something which Engels talks about in the later period of the German revolutionary process, which culminates ultimately with the Bismarckian unification of Germany. He makes the observation that the German bourgeois in the 1840s and 50s are much more terrified of the German proletariat and peasantry than they are of the German reactionaries, than they are of the Junkers, of the Bismarck types, and that they're more happy, the German bourgeois that is, to do a deal with the landowners than they are to actually act in concert with the proletariat. And that's true everywhere. Even when you got in the imperialist countries back in the day, bourgeois factions that would be opposed to certain aspects of the old feudal remnants that were still influential, they would sometimes try to enter into alliances with the proletariat, but they'd quickly betray the proletariat when it looked like the working class might escape their control. And so Mao takes this analysis from Engels and is able to further develop it with reference to the Chinese situation, which of course has relevance to all nations which are subject to imperialist domination. And that's one of Mao's important breakthroughs. So Paul says, great to learn about this topic. I have heard about it before, but the knowledge hasn't solidified or become something that I can use to discuss yet with any confidence. Well, going to be doing more on Mao quite a bit, so hope you get something out of that. Irish Partisan, comrade over there in Minsk, says Chiang Kai-shek wanted to execute the former emperor, Puyi, but Mao opposed it on the basis of humanitarian grounds and the fact that he was the former emperor. Yeah, Mao was the more humanitarian out of the two. Chiang Kai-shek was a fucking arsehole, even by, corrupt comprador standards. And that arsehole, of course, was set up in Taiwan to form what the US imperialists claimed for over 20 years after the Chinese Revolution. Until the early 1970s, they claimed that Taiwan was the real China. I'm surprised that Lindsey Graham or somebody like that hasn't come back to suggesting that again. President Jesus says, still waiting for Netflix or BBC documentary describing Chiang Kai-shek as a tyrant or dictator. Well, you're going to be waiting a long time for that one, mate. Yu Wan asks, is what my view on Maoism is? Well, that's an interesting question, because Maoism, as it is understood by us in the West, is a mess. I mean, I was going to start this episode by playing the old song from the movie Le Chinoise, which is, of course, something which was directed by the great Jean-Luc Godard, a movie that I was convinced was satire until it wasn't, of course. I just played a bit of it there. I'm just going to stick the link in the description here. The movie Le Chinoise I find hilarious because it absolutely sums up everything that's wrong with 1968. And apparently Godard didn't mean it as a satire. If he didn't, then it's unintentionally hilarious. But to return to Yu Wan's question, the Maoism that we know as Maoism in Britain, America, France, Italy, Germany is a joke. It's student radicalism, like it's a complete misunderstanding of many concepts the great Chairman Mao talked about and wrote about extensively, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the great proletarian cultural revolution. Now, I will go much more into that in future episodes, but the biggest misunderstanding was the idea that they could apply the methods that were being used in the Cultural Revolution, which is, of course, taking place in a country which has already had a revolution which chased out the imperialists. They could somehow organize themselves around that principle, and all it turned into was narcissistic students denouncing each other endlessly about one thing or another. You get absurd attempts to start urban guerrilla groups in Nottingham and Stockport in Britain. You got a slightly more serious Mao influence movement in the United States, where you get the Revolutionary Union turned Revolutionary Communist Party, who were at least a movement that was seriously embedded in the American working class movement, which is why the FBI took it so seriously, and why the book by Gallagher and Leonard should be read, called Heavy Radicals. That's a very interesting piece of work. But Maoism in the West it's basically just a student and ultra-leftist joke. It got really stupid at certain points and started denouncing the Soviet Union as social fascist, which is, of course, something which they took from the ultra-left turn in China itself after the late 1960s, and, of course, the turn in Albania, where Enver Hoxha, great revolutionary, but he did get certain things wrong, and the characterization of the Soviet Union as social fascist and social imperialist was completely wrong. And Maoism, though, in different areas of the world deserves to be treated somewhat differently, because you get Mao Zedong fought, which the document we're discussing today and other things that Mao wrote is legitimately a great addition to Marxist-Leninist theory. And so you get people in the colonized world, in the neo-colonial world, who are heavily influenced by that and are able to use the theories of Chairman Mao to great effect. And you get even movements that are practicing protracted people's war, who are, of course, worth taking seriously, like the Nepalese communist, for instance, they did win a long, protracted people's war against the monarchy there and overthrew it. Now, ultimately, that ended in a split, and a pretty disastrous one at that, in the party, and a split between the more radical elements and the more reformist elements. And ultimately, though, a democratic republic was formed in Nepal thanks to a protracted people's war that actually did triumph. And even like in the Philippines and places like that, you get the movement started by Jose Maria Sissoun, where, yes, there's a whole range of things that I wouldn't agree with it about, but they've kept a long struggle going out there in the jungles of the Philippines for many, many decades, and therefore, of course, has to be taken seriously as something which is a long-standing revolutionary process that they've gone through, even if it's one that hasn't succeeded. But the whole way in which this is considered in the West has to be through the frame of that what we know as Maoism is basically stupid student garbage a lot of the time, and it needs to be separated from like the actual thinking of Chairman Mao, which is tremendously influential and is a great addition to our understanding of the theory and practice of revolution. And the Irish Partisan is exactly right, which is that the Black Panthers were influenced by Mao. In fact, I think one of their first big fundraisers was selling the Little Red Book, of which I have an original copy right here. Get one if you can. Still very much worth reading. And so a lot of influence, but often a confused one, not helped by the ultra-left turn that the Chinese Revolution itself took after the middle 1960s, and in the West, largely a joke, as personified by the film. So, well, yes, Paul, to answer your question, I am never driven by popularity. The reverse, in fact. I mean, if I just did 5 streams a week and entitled them Prigozhin, I'd probably get more. Muniz says, it's an entertaining movie, but exactly as you are about to say, I'm sure, it shows the absolute incompetence of any actual revolutionary movement. Yeah, it's hilarious because they're a bunch of ultra petty bourgeois students, but they are completely out of touch with like the French proletariat. They're just a bunch of narcissists shouting at each other and posing, which I think is a very good summation of like what Maoism was in the West. Nothing really to do with the thoughts of Mao at all. Muniz asks, do you have any comments on the Chinese Cultural Revolution in the context to the entire imperialist nature culturally of the Western hippie movement? Sukarno before the coup also banned the Beatles and Elvis, etc. Well, I mean, to be honest with you, Muniz, what I would say about that is that I'm going to take that question and put it in a Q&A, because if I start talking about that, I'm going to be here all night. Briefly, though, the whole movement of Western culture after World War II, heavily influenced by consumerism, etc., is something that we will come to reflect on in the future as something which was degenerate culture, to be quite frank about it, that celebrated basically mindless consumerism, mindless narcotics consumption. And you don't get me wrong, I've listened to a lot of this stuff and have enjoyed it in the past, but one of the things you realize is that a lot of it is just terrifically shallow. It's a bastardization of other much better genres of music, and it ultimately is not very culturally enriching at all. And so I don't blame Sukarno, etc., for banning it, to be blunt. But I think I'll talk much more about that on the Q&A in the near future. Paul asks, a sidestep away from the main topic today, but if you have a chance, could you please give your opinion on Jean-Luc Godard? Godard, I think, was a genius. As I said with Le Chinoise, whether in certain films, he meant to make things that were as funny as I think a lot of them were. I don't know. But I think when it comes to stuff like, I still enjoy Alphaville, for instance. I think that's very good. I still enjoy Weekend, which I think is, it might be his best. It might be his best film. So I will revisit it in terms of doing a film review at some point. But I think that Godard is a genius, and one of France's greatest ever artists, I think. Certainly one of the best filmmakers of the 20th century. And those film critics who don't appreciate Godard's work, well, I don't appreciate them, basically. Ben asks, in reading this piece, Mao's perception of the national bourgeoisie was far more accommodating than the Bolsheviks. Can you explain the difference? Yeah, I think the difference is that, well, the Bolsheviks fought a revolution that was directly against all the elements of the bourgeoisie. The compradors, the national bourgeoisie, all piled in on the side of the white armies after the revolution of 1917. And of course, this meant that they had to be expropriated, their political power brought to a close. And I think even before that, you had a situation prior to the revolution of 1917 where the national bourgeois were not in a position to lead anything, as Mao does observe when it comes to talking about the national bourgeois in both the pieces I have under discussion. But they were all linked to the autocracy. All the liberal tendencies were ready to compromise with Tsarism, and both the comprador and the national bourgeoisie were all linked to imperialism one way or another. In fact, the national bourgeois in the pre-revolutionary Tsarist empire were the ones who were most likely to be imperialists, because this is the other side of it. China, old imperial China, was this fading feudal power with tiny elements of capitalism in it. Russia, Tsarist Russia, even though it was this very backward country when it came to the rest of, well, certainly Western Europe and the United States, was becoming an imperialist power. And you can tell because, of course, they were engaging in predatory imperialist actions when it came to China itself. The Tsarist empire, at the urging, the frenzied urging of the bourgeoisie and the liberals, was very happy to join the attempted dismembering of China, which ultimately leads to the Boxer Rebellion. And they were interested in getting concessions for themselves on the Chinese coast. They made certain loans to the old Chinese government, loans which, by the way, and claims on territory, which the Bolsheviks completely wrote off after 1917, which is one of the reasons why Sun Yat-sen was so favorable towards them, because they'd given up the imperialist claims that the Russian Tsardom had made on China. So when you get the Russian bourgeois were all bound up in the attempt to make the Tsardom an imperialist power. So that's another factor here. And then, of course, in the Chinese case, China had been under foreign domination by the time Mao and the Communist Party of China start their revolutionary process for at least 80 years, probably arguably longer, but certainly since the Opium Wars in the 1840s, there'd been foreign domination of China. And this is one of the reasons why Mao argues that there's a different approach needed when it comes to the national bourgeois, because, again, unlike in Russia, where until like 1917, even though the Tsarist Empire lost wars, it was still an imperialist power that was preying on other nations. The Chinese bourgeois had never been imperialist. They'd never been able to. They were small. The national bourgeois were relatively weak, although they did have They did develop certain interests in areas like steel production, for instance, and they therefore had, as I said earlier, also a certain interest in fighting against, or shall we say, they chafed against the domination exercised over them by the Japanese. So ultimately, I think that the origin of the difference, to finally answer Ben's question, comes in the fact that whereas the Russian bourgeois were bound up in at least the attempt to make Russia into an imperialist power, the Chinese bourgeois the national bourgeois had always been something of a suppressed class. Not as suppressed as the proletariat or the peasantry, of course, but they were suppressed by the foreign domination of the British, of the other European powers, and then of the Japanese, which meant that when it comes to building alliances with them, it was more likely that they were going to, some of them at least, side with the CPC in order to actually rid themselves of Japanese occupation. And I think that is at the heart of what is going on here. It's the imperialist nature of the Russian Tsarist era bourgeois, whereas the Chinese national bourgeois grew up in the century of humiliation, under foreign control, under foreign domination. And so there was more of them who were more likely to be wanting to make an alliance with the proletariat, even temporarily, to actually push the imperialist invaders out. And that is, I think, is what is at the heart of the Chinese party's more moderate approach to them. But I wouldn't argue it's that moderate. I mean, Mao's very clear on the correct handling of contradictions among the people that the position with regard to the national bourgeois is a temporary one. It is an alliance that has been based on the need to overcome the primary contradiction, which is Japanese and then US attempted imperialist domination, and that now they're in the stage of people's democratic dictatorship. They are needing to overcome bourgeois forms of property. But this is going to be, in the middle 50s, they were thinking this was going to be something that was done slowly over a period of time through the re-education of the bourgeoisie, through slowly taking their privately held factories into public administration, and then into full public ownership, into full ownership by the workers and peasant state. So I would say that is the answer to your question there. It all stems from the nature of the imperialist domination of China and the distinctions that were to be drawn between comprador bourgeois and national bourgeois as a result. So, totally agreeing with you. I remember being brought up on this perspective. Oh, it's about the hippies, etc. Yeah, it's one thing I agree with Eric Cartman from South Park about. Yuan asks, did you read Henry Winston's text on the Black Panthers, Huey Newton and the Lumpen Proletariat? Haven't got around to reading it yet, but it's on the list. Alphaville is a classic, says Muniz. Yes, very good. I totally agree, of course. Paul says, thanks for your opinion about Godard. I once owned most of them on DVD and often understood the great humour, but the majority went over my head as a young, not well-educated man. Must watch again. Yeah, I bought like 2 box sets of Godard when I was about 23 and was trying to look very sophisticated for the purposes of impressing women, as most 23-year-old men do most things based around that objective. Of course, I got some of it, but I only get more of it like much later on. So I too must revisit it. But moving back to discussion of Mao and the discussion of on the People's Democratic Dictatorship, which to refresh for those who missed it, we are starting with this before going on in the next episode of this to a consideration of the document on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. So I want to now turn to some other things that Mao highlights in this text, because he deals with some objections to the People's Democratic Dictatorship and to, of course, the dictatorship of the proletariat in alliance with the peasantry. And he says, voicing first an objection, you are too irritating. We are talking about how to deal with domestic and foreign reactionaries, the imperialists and their running dogs, not about how to deal with anyone else. With regard to such reactionaries, the question of irritating them or not does not arise. Irritated or not irritated, they will remain the same because they are reactionaries. Only if we draw a clear line between reactionaries and revolutionaries, expose the intrigues and plots of the reactionaries, arouse the vigilance and attention of the revolutionary ranks, heighten our will to fight and crush the enemy's arrogance, can we isolate the reactionaries, vanquish them, or supersede them. We must not show the slightest timidity before a wild beast. We must learn from Wu Sung on the Qingyang Ridge. As Wu Sung saw it, the tiger on Qingyang Ridge was a man-eater, whether irritated or not. Either kill the tiger or be eaten by him, one or the other. And I think that's a brilliant way of summing it up, because, of course, this, again, we go back to Mao's very interesting observation about, and very correct observation about, class struggle intensifying after the revolution. And this is partly what he's referring to here, and it's, again, something he says with regard to the imperialists, which is like the reactionaries and the imperialists are going to attack the revolution, they're going to attack the workers' state because it's in their nature to do so. It's not a misunderstanding. It's not a breakdown in communication. It's not a failure to communicate properly. It's the nature of things. It's the nature of the imperialists and their servants, the internal reactionaries, to want to destroy the revolution. Now, it may be that there are certain points where you have to have something of a, shall we say, mutually agreed truce or tacitly agreed truce, where neither side is strong enough to overcome the other. But as Mao says in this later, well, you should never allow the internal reactionaries to get a moment's respite, because they'll grow more powerful quickly if you lay off them. And you should never mistake the temporary peace with the imperialists for something which is going to last. And you can't help, again, call back to or recall the actions of the Khrushchevite revisionists, which it was all based on, or at least a lot of it was based on, the idea of Khrushchev and his collaborators that, well, if they just conceded on the revolution, if they just conceded on X, Y, and Z, that the imperialists would leave them alone, that they'd be allowed to develop in peace. This was the public reason behind a lot of it. Same shit that Gorbachev did 30 years later. And of course, they were completely and disastrously wrong. And it was because, again, it's the nature of imperialism to want to dominate absolutely. And unfortunately, later in China, did not have a keen understanding of this. Castro, of course, had a very good understanding of this because, well, how could he not, given that he led a revolution right in the hegemon's backyard. So, yes, very astute quote from Mao there, and of course it is something which he was to return to again and again. Now, the other thing here is to talk about Mao's concept of the people, because this is something which, if you read any of not just Mao's work but those who came after him, the concept of the people is something which is often distinguished against the idea of the proletariat, but Mao's clear on what this actually means. So the point I want to make here is that he defines the people in the following terms. Again, I'll read the quote out. Who are the people? At the present stage in China, they are the working class, the peasantry, the urban petty bourgeoisie, and the national bourgeoisie. These classes, led by the working class and the Communist Party, unite to form their own state and elect their own government. They enforce their dictatorship over the running dogs of imperialism, the landlord class and bureaucrat bourgeoisie, as well as the representative of those classes, the Kuomintang reactionaries and their accomplices, suppress them, allow them only to behave themselves and not to be unruly in word or deed. If they speak or act in an unruly way, they will be promptly stopped and punished. Democracy is practiced within the ranks of the people, who enjoy the rights of freedom of speech, assembly, association, and so on. The right to vote belongs only to the people, not to the reactionaries. The combination of these two aspects, democracy for the people and dictatorship over the reactionaries, is the people's democratic dictatorship. So, this is, again, like a concept which has been much abused and misunderstood. But what he's doing there is, of course, he's highlighting that at this stage of the revolution in China, they are in essentially a coalition of classes, but with the proletariat and the peasantry leading that movement, and the vanguard of that, of course, being the Communist Party of China. And the urban petty bourgeois and the national bourgeois are at that stage playing, in terms of opposing Chiang Kai-shek and in terms of earlier opposing the Japanese, playing a relatively progressive role. But again, Mao's clear, when we go on to discuss the next document, which we'll probably be doing later next week, that the national bourgeois aren't just going to be allowed to grow into political power. They may well be in a coalition with the proletariat and peasantry, but it is the proletariat and the peasantry that are in political power. They are the ones driving the revolutionary process. The national bourgeois' role is respected. They have political rights, but they are not allowed to infringe upon the movement towards socialism. And ultimately, their property is to be slowly socialized, and they themselves are to be re-educated into and integrated into this new society that is being built. And so it's not the case that they just want to keep the national bourgeois there for the purpose of keeping them around. It's that this is an alliance based upon the balance of class forces that was in play when the CPC had to wage its struggle against the Japanese, then against the Kuomintang reactionaries, then against US imperialism. But it's not an alliance that remains frozen in place, and it's one that is continually evolving towards socialism, and that includes evolving the property of the bourgeois into it being socialized and nationalized, and for the bourgeois themselves as individuals to becoming useful members of this new society. So now we've clarified who the people are and who the reactionaries are. He then goes on to talk about what the state means. So he's talking about a people's state, a people's republic, if you will. So he says, the people's state protects the people. Only when the people have such a state can they educate and remold themselves by democratic methods on a country-wide scale, with everyone taking part, and shake off the influence of domestic and foreign reactionaries, which is still very strong, will survive for a long time and cannot be quickly destroyed, rid themselves of the bad habits and ideas acquired in the old society, not allow themselves to be led astray by the reactionaries, and continue to advance towards a socialist and communist society. So there you have Mao in his own words, basically saying that yes, we are running a people's state at the moment, a people's democratic dictatorship, but the dictatorship, of course, is exercised over the reactionaries. The people, as he's outlined, are this combination of classes with the proletariat and the peasantry in the lead role, and the political rights are to be denied to those who stand outside of it, outside of that coalition, those who stand against it. Whereas those who are within that coalition, of course, have political rights and have the ability to actually organize, express their opinions, etc. So then he goes on. So he actually quotes Sun Yat-sen, where Sun Yat-sen, in one of the last pieces of writing that he actually put out, which was his writing from the 1924 Kuomintang National Congress, where Sun Yat-sen actually criticized what he called the so-called democratic states of the West, saying that again, I'll quote Sun Yat-sen's words, the so-called democratic system in modern states is usually monopolized by the bourgeoisie and has become simply an instrument for oppressing the common people. On the other hand, the Kuomintang principle of democracy means a democratic system shared by all the common people and not privately owned by a few. And so again, what Mao and the other leaders of the Chinese party said in these early years, and often they use this in their agitation, was that they were still working with some of the principles that Sun Yat-sen had actually outlined for the Kuomintang, and that Chiang Kai-shek had actually gone against this and actually was a traitor to his own movement, because it was the People's Democratic Dictatorship which was actually the embodiment of the ideas, or the best part of the ideas, of Sun Yat-sen, and that the Kuomintang reactionaries had given up on all of that and had turned the movement in just to simply into a tool of imperialism. And the whole question of like how this was going to be addressed was often put to certainly the national bourgeois in the agitation of the Communist Party of China, was to say, well, look, if you actually want to be rid of the domination by the Japanese imperialists, look at what your supposed party, the old nationalist party, is actually doing. They are the ones who are more keen to collaborate even with the Japanese imperialists than they are to actually free the nation. So that's and one of the interesting things about the Chinese Revolution. It still to this day draws a lot of its influence, its authority, from being the national party, the party that actually freed the nation from foreign domination, whereas, of course, all of the others compromised with it. So, just a couple of other things on this particular document before we draw this to a close. So, he's talked there about the national revolution, about the coalition of class forces, and the other thing that he talks about here is to draw on something we mentioned earlier. He says that, having quoted Sun Yat-sen, he says, well, in that case, why did Sun Yat-sen's revolution fail? Because Sun Yat-sen advocated, as Mao says in this writing, the arousing the masses of the people, giving assistance to the peasants and the workers. But as Mao says, well, who's going to rouse them? Who's going to give assistance to them? And as he analyzes Sun Yat-sen's quote there, he says, well, ultimately, the national bourgeoisie, although it may be opposed to imperialism, can't rouse the masses reliably, because even if it's opposed to Japanese imperialism or US imperialism, it's still more afraid of the masses and is unable to command them because of the fear that it has of them. It can play a useful role in alliance with the masses, but again, this is something which has to be led by the proletariat and the peasantry themselves. The national bourgeois, even though more progressive, of course, than the compradors, will inevitably crumble, compromise, and fail in nations like China. So, again, this is an interesting reflection. Now, to go back to Yu Wan's question from earlier on in the chat, which is Trump greatly bolstered by the national bourgeoisie? I think I'm going to end on answering this question, which is that you can't analyze American class relations or the class relations of any imperialist country using the same categorizations of the bourgeois as an anti-imperialist struggle would in a country like China. I would argue that, first of all, in the United States, Britain, France, Germany, whichever imperialist nation you want to pick out, these bourgeoisies, particularly in the United States, there's no such thing as a national bourgeois there. Not in the same way that Mao's referring to. Mao's referring to a capitalist class which is partly suppressed by foreign domination and chafes against foreign domination. In terms of the class formation of the American capitalist class right now, you may well get some capitalists that are still more regional, but the American capitalism isn't suppressed, or no section of it is suppressed by another imperialist country, an imperialist country. They're not being occupied by like imperialist Canada or something. The national bourgeois that Mao talks about, that other anti-colonial revolutionaries talk about, doesn't really exist in the United States. All of the bourgeoisie in these countries are intimately interlinked with the system of imperialism. There is no real national bourgeoisie in the United States that is suppressed, that is not linked by 1,000 strands into the banking system, into the systems that are ultimately dominated and run by financial capitalism. Now, there are smaller capitalists in the United States who might look at this current formation of capitalism in the US or in Britain or in France and think, well, this isn't fair. I'm not getting my fair share of the profits. I'm being squeezed by the big guys, and I don't think that's fair. And that might have an influence on, like, Trump's support. Some of those people probably are Trump supporters. But can these people play a progressive role as a class, even in the same way that, like, the distinction that Mao draws there about the national bourgeois could when it comes to China? And I would argue no, because in the case of the national bourgeois in China in the 30s and 40s, capitalism was, of course, relatively new to China, relatively small. And as Mao says in the document we've just been discussing, it's, of course, couldn't be done away with all at once. They still had to use certain capitalist methods, like the Bolsheviks had for a while with the NEP, to regrow certain aspects of the Chinese economy. And therefore they needed to keep up the alliance with the national bourgeois for a certain period of time. The question of does this apply in the American case, well, I think that has to be answered in the negative, because you have a situation where American capitalism now, what progressive role does it play? It's not something which has been suppressed or barely developed. You've got the most fully developed capitalist nation in the world in America right now. So you can't argue that there's some section of the bourgeoisie that has been suppressed or is chafing against it. They might chafe against the limitations of their profits by the bigger capitalists, and you may end up with individuals from the lower end of the bourgeoisie defecting to an American revolutionary movement. But this would be as individuals, not as some sort of national bourgeois, because this, in the US terms, doesn't really exist, not in the same way that Mao's talking about here. So Trump's support, I think some of it does come from the lower end of the capitalist class, but these aren't people with a particularly progressive role to play, not as a class anymore, because capitalism, not just monopoly capital, imperialism has played itself out inside the United States, and you could say the same for Western Europe, but all of capitalism has played itself out inside the United States. It's all degenerate. It's all capable of nothing but asset stripping and destruction of the means of production now. And so any American Communist Party may well, of course, welcome individuals from the bourgeoisie who essentially want to defect to the new and rising proletarian class. But again, this won't be the same arrangement that the communists in China were forced to engage in during that early period of the People's Democratic Dictatorship or the New Democracy. It'll be the defection of some individual bourgeois, but you'll be moving into a situation in the United States where you have to actively extirpate the capitalist mode of production because it's simply completely played out its usefulness. Again, you have the most advanced capitalist nation in the world, which the only thing it is capable of doing now is eroding and destroying its own industrial base, where the bourgeois government in America is desperately trying to bribe the various different imperialist entities into investing back in the United States again, and it's not even managing to succeed at doing that. So this system is wholly degenerate, and it's run out of time. The American proletariat will have to sweep it away, and will have to reconstitute society anew. Now, will that mean some kind of intermediate stages? Well, I'm not an American, so I'm not going to attempt to outline plans for the US revolution. But certainly, US capitalism just needs to be swept away. It's wholly degenerate now. And the lower end of it might get bitter and angry and want to support Trump, but their version of capitalism is no more progressive, really, certainly not for the proletariat, than the capitalism of the imperialists. It's just a bit smaller and angry and jealous of them. So, I've been going for quite a while now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to end it here. And now what we've done tonight is go through the basics of what the People's Democratic Dictatorship is, what Mao considered to be the constitution of the group known as the people, what different class elements that was made up of. And so next time, this time next week, we're going to go through the actual major document, which is on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. This has been basically an extended warm-up for that. Thank you for coming along. Thank you to everybody who contributed to the discussion. So Muniz, Sneaks, Paul, Pablo, Irish Partisan, President Jesus, Yuan, and yep, that's the lot. So thank you everybody for tuning in. I'll be back again tomorrow with a consideration of the awfulness of the charity industrial complex. So I hope you can join me for that. But until then, I'll bid you good night.